calls, so thank you very much to you. And I just want to mention my name, the sponsoring organizations. These are all active members in our partnership. Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, Friends of the Cloquet Valley State Forest, the WHA Cave chapter of the Izaak Walton League, Save Lake Superior Association, Water Legacy, Sierra Club, North Star chapter, Save Our Sky Blue Waters, and Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. So thanks to all those groups for helping pull this together. And there's a few other participating organizations listed in your program. Finally, a big thank you to the Lloyd K. Johnson Foundation of Duluth for their major sponsorship of this forum. This bright, brilliant projector is thanks to them. So we have a lot to do tonight. I hope we can do it with respect and with a shared concern for our natural resources. And I do want to ask everyone to respect the time limits we set so we can get to everyone's business. Steve Forrest. Steve is the Executive Director of Minnesota Environmental Partnership. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to all of you who are taking some of your really valuable personal time to learn more about this topic and also to share your thoughts about this topic, just as importantly. And thank you, Andrew, for the great work in helping to pull all this together. First, I would, before I get into just a few comments, I would like to recognize a few special guests we have with us here today, and we are very appreciative of them joining us here today. We have Representative Eric Simonson from District 7B, and from District 7A, which is also up this year in Duluth as a call house district, we have Jen Schultz and Christine Osbach, who are both Thank you for being here. And we also have a statewide candidate who is running for Attorney General, and that's Andy Dawkins.
Thanks, Steve.
So I want to make 3 quick points, and I better take out my phone just to make sure I stay exactly on target, because we have a lot to do here tonight. First of all, I want to talk about Lake Superior. There's a reason it's called Superior. It's our Great Lake, and it's also, as so many things in Minnesota, it is above average. 10% of the world's freshwater supply. It's by far the cleanest, and most importantly, it's ours. We don't own it exclusively, but it is the Great Lake that we border and is part of Minnesota. The St. Louis River is the largest U.S. tributary to Lake Superior, so it's really one of the true headwaters of the Great Lakes. So what we do here actually affects everybody in the whole Great Lakes system, going downstream, all the way through to Lake Ontario. We've made a real commitment to cleaning up the Great Lakes, the Lake Superior, and most importantly, probably the estuary of Lake Superior here in the Duluth area, where public-private resources have been working aggressively for the last 8 years, where we will be putting in literally hundreds of millions of dollars of public money to restore and take care of legacy pollution problems from years past. This is a really important resource, and that's why we're here today. We're making a public investment now to clean up the estuary. We also want to make the public investment to protect the headwaters and the waters of the river. Mercury is one of the great, intractable, complex water issues we face in the state today. Had many years of work to address the Mercury issue, and it's complex. I'm thinking back to 2006 when the legislature, with the urging of a lot of citizens, passed legislation which called for a 90% reduction of emissions from power plants, 90% reduction of mercury in emissions from power plants. So we've made a lot of progress statewide. We've done a Mercury TMDL, which is affecting all the mercury around the lakes across the state. But in some areas, such as the St. Louis River, the work we've done simply isn't enough. We know that even everything that's being done is not going to get us where we need to go. And the truth is, the answer to the mercury issue is complex. It's really not likely to be a single bullet, not likely to be one thing that's going to take care of it and control the mercury in the St. Louis River. Rather, we'll have some complex strategies to restore the river. Part of that process is the federal TMDL law. I just want to spend a couple of minutes kind of framing the TMDL. Now there I go, using a term that probably doesn't mean anything to most of you. But what the TMDL is, it's part of the Federal Clean Water Act. And it's part of the act that says when you have waters that are, okay, the law says impaired, we say polluted. When you have waters that are polluted, you have to figure out what's causing the pollution, figure out where it's coming from, and develop a TMDL, which is really a plan. It's a roadmap, if you will, of how you go from your current status to restored water that is below the levels of what's considered polluted, all right, or at least legally polluted. It can be a little polluted, but not past the levels. And the important thing is the TMDL creates a lot of information along the way. It informs the discussion, and it also is then used as a basis for permitting decisions made by all types of regulatory and permitting agencies in the watershed. So it's a really important tool to figure out where we are, the assessment, the identification of the sources, and then the plan, the strategy of how we fix it. Now, the thing about TMDLs, and we do them all over the state, and because of the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, we're doing them aggressively across the state, by watershed by watershed. And what I've found out working on these in the last 10 years or so is they're not perfect. They're way short of perfect. As a matter of fact, when it comes to non-point agriculture, by design they're imperfect because we don't have tools in the Clean Water Act to deal with non-point agriculture. And they're also not permanent. We actually go back and look at the TMDLs, these plans. We have a 10-year rotation in the state to go back and look at the TMDLs that are done, improve them, new information, bring them up to date. So it's really important that we get these on the ground because it is about assessing current knowledge, identifying sources, causes, and a plan to clean up the water. It's about bringing the best current science to bear to say, where are we? And what's the best advice we can provide? What's the best plan we can provide now? What this forum is about we're really ready to start that journey on the St. Louis River specifically. Beyond the statewide work, we need to get to work on the St. Louis River, and what are the next steps that we can do now? TMDLs can be improved in the future, but isn't it time to get a solid plan for cleanup of the St. Louis River now? What I say is let's not let the perfect TMDL get in the way of progress today. We need to start moving forward. The last point I'd make is just how important public engagement is in this process. It's fairly technical, as you're going to hear some tonight. So bear with us. Be part of the discussion. Because it's only when the public gets involved and says, yes, we really care about this, that these things actually move forward. And so the public engagement is really important. What this is today, this is a conversation between concerned citizens and our government. It's our governments that we're going to be talking with today, that are charged with protecting our resources, protecting our water, keeping it safe, healthy, and clean. And so let's have that dialogue to figure out what are the next steps. I want to underscore the process tonight. It's really important to have a good, successful dialogue that we be respectful and we allow people the opportunity to share their thoughts if we agree with them or not agree with them, and then be respectful and that we listen because we're all going to learn something here today. We're here to clean up the river so that we can eat the fish, very simply. There's been a long history of concern about the St. Louis River, and we want to see things move forward now and in the longer term. What are the next significant steps that we can take to reducing mercury and protecting the outstanding resource, which is the St. Louis River? Thank you all for coming and really look forward to a good, lively dialogue. And let me turn it over to Kristen Larson, who's going to be emceeing or moderating this group now. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm really, really glad to see so many of you here and ready to tackle the problem of mercury in the St. Louis River. I'm Kristen Larson. I'm here with friends of the Cloquet Valley State Forest. The Cloquet Valley State Forest, the Cloquet Valley State Forest is the 3 327,000 plus acre working forest, which begins about 20 miles directly north of Duluth and stretches from its northeast point in Grimson across all the way to 53. So it runs roughly from Island Lake all the way up to the Cloquet River flows about 100 miles from Cloquet Lake, which is not far from Grimson, to its confluence with the St. Louis River downstream of Brookston, Minnesota. And it contributes roughly 1/3 of the flow of the St. Louis River at the point of entry. The working forest is home to lots of people like myself who live on, many of us on lakes, and also an incredible variety of wildlife and plants that make the forest one of the jewels of our region's natural resource treasures. This portion of tonight's forum, we will hear from 3 community members. These are your neighbors, with extraordinary expertise relevant to Mercury and our environment. Each one of these resident experts has a strong desire to share their understanding of why Mercury is a problem for people in our region, how Mercury gets in the water, what happens to it when it's in the river, and why it's still in our river and in our fish. But first, a bit of housekeeping. There are cards that have been passed out. Does everybody have a card, or do we still need to pass out the cards and the pencils? Lori and Jill will be making sure that you have cards in hand. As we go along, if you have a question or you want to make a statement, write it on the card, pass it towards the center. And we'll pick them up and we'll make sure that those are part of the record of this evening, and we're going to try and get to some questions. So make sure you get those in. And there are some handouts in the back that will be helpful, including a fish advisory that will explain some of the details that are involved. Now, I'd like to introduce our first panel member, Dr. Sue Nordine. Dr. Nordine trained right here in Duluth at the University of Minnesota Medical School. She graduated from residency in family medicine in 1997. She's worked in family medicine clinics in Wisconsin and Minnesota and worked as faculty for the University of Minnesota Medical School, Duluth. As a physician, Dr. Nordine is very interested in prevention of illness and disease and in teaching health-related topics in order to promote health. Dr. Nordine is going to explain to us what threat Mercury poses to people, how it impacts our family's health, and what Mercury's impact on our community is. Dr. Nordine?
Thank you, Kristen, for your kind introduction. I appreciate that. And please keep me on time. Okay. I'm speaking on my own behalf, and I wouldn't be here tonight if I didn't feel this was a very important topic.
Can everybody hear well?
Louder.
A little louder. Okay. So I wouldn't be here tonight even unless I didn't.
I understand not to attend to that while I noticed that.
So I'm speaking on my own behalf, and I wouldn't be here tonight if I didn't feel this was a very important topic. It's an honor to be here in the presence of so many other people, very knowledgeable speakers who have worked hard for many years on decreasing mercury in our waters and in improving water quality, which ultimately improves the health of all of us. I have a picture on my desk at work that was taken last month of my 15-year-old son when he went on a trip to the Quetico. And in that picture, he is holding fish that he caught on that trip that are nice, very large walleye and bass and northerns and a few trout. And he consumed quite a few of those fish himself. And of course, being the downer mom that I am, when he returned from his trip, I said, Ryan, I'm a little worried about the amount of mercury that you might have ingested. And he said, well, how can that be, Mom? You know, the waters in the Quetico are so pristine, it's wilderness, the water is clean. How is it possible that fish could be unhealthy to eat? And I think that is a nice segue into what we're talking about tonight, even though that's not the St. Louis River. it's reflective of this issue. So mercury, I'll be speaking about mercury and what it is and the health effects of mercury tonight. Mercury is a heavy metal toxin. It's important because it is a neurotoxin and affects human health by harming the brain and nervous system. And humans are primarily exposed by eating fish. The people most at risk from ingestion of mercury and exposure to mercury are the developing fetus and young children due to their development of brain and nervous system during those sensitive periods. It is very common for people to be exposed to methylmercury. I would say that probably everyone in this room has some level of methylmercury in their bodies. And it's very common to have levels of methylmercury that have importance, because even at the levels that we're talking about, having to do with simply eating fish on a regular basis, is known to have health effects. And this is known from large population studies that have been done in populations that eat large amounts of fish. And so that, I think, is quite important. My take-home point tonight will be how it is important that we reduce and limit the exposure that we have to methylmercury. So methylmercury is toxic to humans and wildlife. Again, it's a heavy metal, it's a toxic heavy metal. And it affects humans because we are at the top of the food chain when it comes to eating fish. And I'm not going to explain how mercury gets into fish. I'll leave that to these experts here. But the concerning thing to me is that methylmercury accumulates and concentrates in fish tissue, sometimes as much as 1 million times, so that a large fish that has eaten smaller fish, that has eaten small bacteria, that has taken mercury and methylated it so it becomes biologically active and harmful, can have 1 million times as much mercury in their tissues, that big fish, as compared to the surrounding water in which it lives. And that process is called bioaccumulation. So who can be affected? Again, everyone can be affected by methylmercury, but the developing fetus, young children, are the most vulnerable, and this is because their brain and nervous systems are developing. And methylmercury, unlike some other toxins, actually has pretty free access to the brain and placenta. And this is because it forms compounds in our bodies that mimic important proteins. So it's kind of got an open door into the brain and into the placenta. And in the placental blood, mercury concentrations actually are almost twice as much as in a mother's bloodstream. So this is important, as well as the fact that babies do not eliminate methylmercury from their bodies well, because they haven't developed the bacteria in their bodies in order to do that process. It takes about a year sometimes to get rid of methylmercury in our bodies, and so in terms of pregnancy and contemplating pregnancy, that's important, because if a mother is thinking of becoming pregnant and having a child, the mercury that they've been exposed to in the year prior may have an impact on that pregnancy. Methylmercury is also passed through breast milk. How commonly are people exposed? Well, commonly enough so that in 45 states, fish advisories were recommended in 2003, which put limits on eating certain kinds of fish because of mercury levels. And as I've seen stated at some of the tables, and one thing that I find alarming in our own region is that in a 2011 study done by the EPA and the Minnesota Department of Health, 1 in 10 babies in the Minnesota side of the Lake Superior Basin were found to have levels of mercury in their blood higher than the EPA reference dose. And this is important because that EPA reference dose is a dose at which, if you go above, that it is known that certain harms, particularly harms to the nervous system, such as IQ and attention, memory, language, and other neurological functions are affected. And we know this from those large population studies that have been done. So 1 in 10 babies in our region have been found to have that elevated level, and it was higher, interestingly, during the summer months when fish consumption was felt to be higher as well. So it is certainly possible that 1 in 10 babies has the potential for having harms and decrements in their IQ and neurologic problems related to their exposure to mercury in utero. So does this mean that maybe we just should stop eating fish? I don't think so at all. That's not the recommendation, and that's because fish is a very good source of protein. It's an inexpensive source of protein, and it also has very healthy fatty acids that are important for our health and our bodies. However, the US FDA has set a limit on methylmercury in fish tissue that is intended for human consumption, and that limit is 1 part per million. It sounds like a tiny, tiny amount, and it is. But that speaks to how toxic this element, this metal, is. And so what do we do about that? We need to be aware of how much fish we consume. We need to be aware of where that fish is coming from, and we need to work towards cleaning the waters and decreasing the amounts of methylmercury that get into our fish. In the St. Louis River, some of the lower reaches of the St. Louis River, walleye was found to have methylmercury concentrations of 0.971 parts per million, which is very close to that 1 part per million that is the limit for fish consumption. And that actually is comparable to swordfish and shark and certain fish that we are recommended not to eat if we're under 15 or pregnant. And I find that really alarming. So there are fish advisories. I think here is probably a nice little outline. There are fish advisories in the back, and this is just a little piece of one of those. This is a walleye, and walleye do tend to be higher in methylmercury because they eat other fish. They're a predator fish. And so I don't want to go on and on about fish advisories because there's more information in the back. But I think being very aware that eating smaller fish, eating fish that are not predator fish or are smaller predator fish instead, and being really aware of your advisories in your lakes is important. So how does this affect the nervous system? I want to get into the meat of this a little bit. The brain and the nervous system, of course, are very complex and really intricate and complex and really elegantly designed, an elegantly designed organ. And when it is being formed, disruptions in the timing, disruptions in the process of how the structures are formed, really can have an impact on brain areas failing to develop or nerves failing to connect to where they're supposed to go. And if that occurs, then of course that affects your brain function and can have effects on IQ and memory, language, attention, and other effects. It's known that methylmercury prevents proper release of some neurotransmitters, such as dopamine. Neurotransmitters are the molecules in between the nerve cells, and when nerve cells are trying to communicate with one another, they use neurotransmitters. So if neurotransmitters are disrupted, that affects how the nerves communicate. And when this happens, that can affect mood, that can affect memory, that can affect attention, movement, motor function, and can result in things like ADHD and other things like that. And alarmingly, this can occur at very low levels of methylmercury exposure. This is the low levels that I'm talking about are the levels at which people who consume fish on a regular basis may be exposed to, which is all of us. Methylmercury also affects the formation of nerve cells and their proper structure and causes, so the structure of the nerve cells, if that's not correct, then they can't reach where they need to go to talk to other nerve cells and communicate and send impulses. Methylmercury also is toxic to nerve cells and causes some of them to die. So again, if you don't have proper structure and you don't have proper cells, and you have some cells that have died in certain areas of the brain that are simply not there, that is going to be resulting in some effects of how the brain works and can result in problems with memory and IQ, and language, and behavior, and attention. Methylmercury also can affect cardiovascular health in studies that have been done. I'm not going to talk very much about that, but it has been linked to increased heart attacks in men who consume fish. Those studies were done on men, so not women. I'm sure it may affect women as well. And so looking at this all has an impact on us and our society. It has economic impacts, it has societal impacts. And it's known that as you go above the reference dose of mercury in the blood, that IQ points decline. And it's also known that as IQ points decline, even small amounts of IQ points, that affects a person's ability to earn wages, to make a living, and that costs the U.S. annually hundreds of millions of dollars. The National Research Council estimates also that 60,000 children in the U.S. each year may require special education related only to methylmercury exposure in utero. And the cost of that education for those kids is close to $5 billion annually. And these are only economic costs. I think also about, what about the emotional costs to a family? What about the community costs? So it's not only dollars, but there are dollars that are involved here. In addition, currently, even today, there are too few child and adolescent psychiatrists to meet the needs of kids that have neuropsychiatric disorders. And again, I find this alarming because that is on the rise. So, almost done. All right. So what can we do about this? You know, as was said just a bit ago, okay, becoming aware, learning about this issue, recognizing, wow, we do need to do something. This is serious. And becoming engaged, talking to industry, talking to politicians, talking to agencies, and really working together to decrease emissions of pollution and lowering, in this case, methylmercury, but certainly other things as well. Make your voice heard. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I would put forth that we must all be involved in reducing methylmercury exposure.